So today we're talking to Dr Karen Pashby, a reader in the School of Childhood, Youth and Education Studies here at Manchester Met. Broadly, we'll be speaking to Karen about the big issues that surround her subject at the moment and how her research relates to that. So Karen, do you want to start by telling us a bit about your background before you came to Manchester Met?
Sure, yeah. It was a bit happenstance that I ended up in Manchester, but it's been a happy happenstance for sure. I grew up in Toronto in Canada and was a high school teacher, secondary school teacher there, and also in Brazil, and then went on to do graduate studies in education and did a postdoc in Finland at the University of Oulu and another postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Alberta at the Center for Global Citizenship Education and Research. And it was after that that I came over to Manchester Met, originally to help promote some programming in the area of global citizenship education.
Great. So can you tell me a bit more about your research interests?
For sure. I didn't mention that while I was doing my PhD at University of Toronto, I was also teaching in teacher education. So my research really is based in my experience as a secondary teacher and teacher educator. And what I'm most interested in is the way we talk about the world in the classroom. That's a very simple way of putting it. Paulo Freire said you need to read the word, but also read the world. So how is it that the way we talk about global issues in classrooms actually constructs or sets forward for us certain narratives about who we are and who others are in the world? And I'm really interested in trying to ensure that those kinds of pedagogies, meaning teaching and learning approaches in the classrooms, are really taking up some of our deep ethical questions around inequalities. So I work with teachers to kind of bridge theory in that area and practice.
I think that's a topic that's come under a lot of scrutiny as well recently, hasn't it, with recent political events? But we'll go into that in a bit more detail later. So could you tell me about your motivations to get into this field and what led to you wanting to look into global citizenship and the pedagogical approaches to it?
Sure. Well, when I worked in Toronto, I worked at one point at a school that had over 40 home languages spoken among the students. And I also did my final student teacher placement in the north of Quebec in a community that included French-speaking, English-speaking, and also what we call in Canada First Nations and Indigenous populations. And then I went to Brazil and taught at a school, that was quite a privileged population, but also quite diverse people, expats and local Brazilians. And it was actually when I was working at that school that I was on a committee to work on a mission statement for the school. And one of the things that the mission statement was considering taking up was this idea of, the schools promoting global citizens. But what I found so interesting at the time was that concept of global citizenship brought out all sorts of desires of what we wanted the school to be, but also a lot of debate. And there's so many different views of what that term means. So when I went back to Toronto and started my master's, I continued exploring this and I haven't stopped since. But I think what really attracts me to it is that dynamic tension, where it's a term and a concept that we as members of the human community are drawn to for really deep, important reasons to make kind of a better world, to put it simply, but it's also fraught with the very tensions that have defined our human relations in the world. So what I like to do is try and find the productive tensions, and actually those can be moments of what we call learning or unlearning. There's pedagogical potential in there.
So when you say productive tensions, could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, so in my work, I draw on a lot of theoretical resources from post-colonial, decolonial, and anti-colonial theoretical frameworks. And what I'm interested in particularly is what they can do pedagogically. And what I see that lots of these kind of critical theories, particularly those that are interested in taking up colonialism in its historical and contemporary form, is that they start to make visible processes and systems of oppression that we often step over. And in global learning, this can happen a lot, because what can happen is what I famously have called, and now I'm famous for saying, happy, happy, clappy, clappy. Sort of like, we want to change the world. And that's a beautiful thing. Like, I'm not against that. But what I have found with my work with young people and with teachers is that it can leave us at a very superficial level. And it actually can reinforce our existing ways of relating, instead of thinking really deeply and seriously about relating differently with people in our local and global communities who are, experience a very different life from ours.
Was it Quebec that you first kind of came across the concept of a global citizen? I think it's a concept that maybe we're more aware of now, but from historically, like as a concept, is it something that was slower to arrive in the UK? Or
really good question. I think there has been really strong anti-colonial and anti-racist activism and pedagogy here. So I would never want to say it hasn't come. I think it's just the way it's mobilized, and that's a complicated process. In Canada, we do have a different history of nation building, and our meta-narratives are different. So I could go on and on, but it's a fraught country. It already was established with a French population, an English population, but also multiple First Nations who had been living on the land for thousands of years. So it's like the notion of being Canadian is highly contested, and same with Britain, right? But it's just plays out a bit differently. So we were the first country to have an official Multiculturalism Act. But what we've seen is, although that's opened up some really important spaces, especially for minoritized communities to actually defend themselves, all the way to the Supreme Court to maintain their identity, and it's done some important work, it's also, again, created this kind of like, oh, well, we're already multicultural, we already know what we're doing, exceptionalism that actually works against a lot of these things. Whereas in the UK, I think, just based on my experience, and again, I think there's a very long history here that we could be taking up more readily. I do think the discussions around inequalities in education in particular have a stronger class focus, which is something probably in Canada we could be learning from. But I don't hear as much work around things like anti-racist pedagogy and teacher education, for example, although I think it's done in pockets here really well. So I'm not trying to say it's not done at all, but it's like just not a thing as much. So in Ontario, it's actually part of the Ontario College of Teachers professional traits that you have to indicate, and professional skill set they have to indicate when you're becoming or training to become a teacher is being able to deal with equity and diversity. So it's just different. I'm not trying to say we have it all sorted out there, but I think there's some ways to go here. And one of them is around colonialism and how we take that up and how we talk about that, and what's done with that in our classrooms. It was kind of a shocking moment to me when our undergrads didn't know what the word Indigenous meant, or Indigenous people meant. It was such a good question. It's not the fault at all of our students, who are incredible. But at least in Canada, most students will know what that means. Doesn't necessarily mean we're further ahead, but there's work to be done here, yeah, for sure.
So to bring it back to your research, what specific groups in society does your research impact?
I've been involved in a lot of different research projects, but my more recent work has been focused on secondary and upper secondary school teachers. And other work I've done has been with youth, mostly with secondary youth. And the impact we're trying to have is kind of a dialogical impact. So we're working, so when I say we, I've been working quite closely with my research partner, Louise Sund, who is in Sweden at Mälardalen University and does most of her research at Örebro University. And she does work in environmental and sustainability education and taking up, the ways that it does or doesn't engage with colonial legacies, which actually, when you start to think about it, really are at the root of our ongoing environmental problems. And so we've been working together to really work with teachers to create and enable them to take up some of these theoretical resources in their classrooms, and also to speak back to us and to the scholarly community to ensure that we're really pushing the edges of the debates in ways that take up the lived realities of our classrooms. So she and I kind of see ourselves in those two positions, and we're hoping to grow that work to be more directly involved with young people again. So the project we're working on, we're just finishing up, it's our final year in Sweden, looking at ethical global issues in classrooms there, included work both with teachers and students.
And one of the findings of that research project I'm aware of is that it was evidence of how national policy, culture and context influence teachers' perceptions in somewhat surprising ways. Can you elaborate on that and what those surprising ways were?
Yeah, I mean, they were surprising to me. Maybe other people will shake their heads and say, that's not that surprising. But so there's different kind of pedagogical cultures in the three national contexts, which, well, I won't bore you all with. But one of the things I was a bit concerned about was that in England, there's this very strong high stakes testing culture. And as someone who does not come from a jurisdiction that does leaving tests like GCSE or A levels in the same way that's done here, it's something that kind of still I find shocking because it's like a whole industry is revolved around, and people's entire lives and professions revolve around these high stakes tests, which are in the middle of having a bit of an identity crisis, as we know, in the context of COVID. However, I was assuming that the teachers here would have a lot of constraints because of that, understandably, and that perhaps the teachers in Sweden, where there are still some exams, but they have more of a discussion-based didactic culture. And then in Sweden, they do some more interdisciplinary work, although they still have quite a strong, strongly packed curriculum. But what ended up happening was teachers in all of the different contexts, to varying degrees, were happy to take up this work and use it in their classroom. So we were using a tool that helps you to address some of these hidden systems of oppression that we can tend to step over, and it brings them to the fore. The teachers in England were amazing. They were doing like such, you could say it was sort of subversive in some ways work. But you could also just say that it actually still met the needs of the testing culture. But they're so creative, and there's actually ways within this constrained environment to do this work. And that was really demonstrated by the small amount of teachers. It was a small project, but it's still very interesting to see.
So speaking about the courses that we have at Manchester Met, how does your research influence those?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I do quite a bit of work on the undergrad, but what's really exciting is how many students we have coming out of undergrad going into postgrad studies in this area. And recently we had a student successful in White Rose 3+1 scholarship, so that means she'll be doing a year of her master's into her PhD in the area of critical global citizenship education. She wants to look at how a food bank could be a site of critical global citizenship education. Katie Ormrod is her name. So that's just an example of the kind of momentum I feel like we're having. Together with Sam Seller, I lead a research group called Education and Global Futures, and it has researchers from across the faculty, but it has an awful lot of them who are teaching active. So across the postgrad and undergrad programs. And so we're really working to infuse our research and these kinds of questions into our teaching, but also to bring the students into the conversation, because that's what's really exciting, is that, you know, students have loads of experiences to bring. And so I've also done a little bit of work in the postgrad. There's, across the core units, there's opportunities to discuss issues around globalization. And when I've been supervising master's dissertations, you know, it's amazing, like whether you're looking at special education needs or you're looking at, you know, how students living in poverty are implicated and affected by current policy changes. Like I have another student looking at the role of foreign language teaching in the UK and why it appears to be going down. And like all of these topics actually intersect with these issues. And so I really like that about our postgrad programs, that we get to interact with our research interests, but also get informed by what the students are bringing in.
And it demonstrates as well what the value of research actually is, in that by doing it, you are actually having a real impact on the world and possibly on policy and on future practice by doing it.
Yeah, and there's opportunities. I mean, everybody comes into, for example, postgrad for different reasons, right? Could be like me, where I worked for several years and then did my postgrad. You could be coming straight out of your undergrad. And so really it's up to you what you do with that opportunity to learn. And maybe I'm preempting a question here, but my advice to students would be, really open your mind and take the opportunity to get your thoughts shooken up a little bit, because when they come back down, perhaps in your dissertation, but also perhaps just later in life, in your own life, in whatever job you find yourself in, you will find yourself a deeper thinker, a more able to understand justice issues around you, and at least explain them to yourself and others if we can't, if we're still working on how to solve them. That's, to me, my master's was like the most amazing part of my educational experience, and I'm basically a professional student, so that's saying a lot. So yeah, I really think that postgrad opens up this opportunity, and it's up to the student to kind of dive in there and take it up.
What was it that made you want to make that move into academia? Because you mentioned that you worked as a teacher for a while.
Yeah, so after I came back from teaching in Brazil and had all sorts of, as of then, not productive tensions in my mind around the role of how schooling affects society, how society affects schooling, and I knew I wanted to spend some time unpacking that. So I did a Master's of Education at York University in Toronto that included a dissertation. You had to do a dissertation defense, if you can imagine. It was pretty intense, but it was amazing. I learned and unlearned so much, and I started to find resources theoretically to explain those difficulties I found as a teacher. Because as a teacher, you're working in your classroom. Your classroom's like a little microcosm of the world, right? And then so is the school. The school's a microcosm of the world. And then so anything that's going on in society plays itself out in our classrooms. And as a teacher, you're this kind of mediator or broker of that, how you're going to facilitate that. So for me, my master's provided me with lots of excellent theoretical resources to unpack these things. While I was doing my master's, I had a couple of professors who were teaching me kind of pull me aside and say, look, I was doing it full time, but lots of my colleagues were part time, and we were all in the same classes. And, they're trying to read the article as they've taught all day on the bus to, they were amazing what they were doing, but I had the opportunity to actually sit with it more. And so anyways, a few of the profs said, Karen, you're really good at talking about the theory with, the people that have been teaching all day and are really in the classroom context. And we need people like that in faculties of education. And I was about to turn 30, and I was like, do I really want to so anyways, long story short, I decided to take them up on their suggestion, and that's sort of how I ended up pursuing my PhD.
Relating back to the students in education now, how do you think what's going on across the world right now will impact their study ambitions going forward?
It's a really interesting question. I think it's there's a wider issue that, I was just saying, how teachers are in a classroom that's a microcosm of all of the issues going on in society. I mean, higher education's in that right now too, right? There's a lot of questions about what's the purpose of higher education, and notions of what do we do with our degrees and what jobs can we get? And these are all really important questions. And I can't answer them all, and I can't solve a lot of those tensions for our students. But really, for me, a huge purpose of doing a postgrad degree in particular, or an undergraduate degree, is to gain the experience of thinking and applying thinking. And that ought to be useful in whatever context you find yourself in. And I continue to believe that's very important. And I continue to believe that in faculties of education, we have some of the most important discussions and debates in society right now, because they all come to bear on education. So if you come and study with us, you at the very least are going to have a much more informed stance on what are the key debates. And even if we can't necessarily help you with, here's your checklist of solutions, you will know how to maneuver in strategic ways and to take up a solution and continue to reflect on that.
Would you say it's quite a daunting position to be a teaching student then at the moment? You know, someone who maybe has just finished the first year of their the teaching course, or maybe they're thinking about going into the first year. What would you say to them?
I think there's a lot going on in the public consciousness right now. It's important to remember that because it's in our public consciousness right now does not mean it's not always there, right? But there is this sort of heightened response to overlapping, intersecting issues of inequalities. We're seeing how COVID is impacting different communities differently. Racialized communities, marginalized communities are being overly impacted. The lockdown had impacts much more on marginalized communities than it did on people like me who could find a safe space and just work from home. And at the same time, so many of us were at home, and then we could see videos of things like, what happened in the US and people getting, brutalized, and we're witnessing it in certain ways. But it's important to recognize that this is all being heightened in important ways at the moment, but these are not new. These are the same issues we've been talking about in our types of programs for a long time. And I do a lot of work in ed studies. And one of the things the students say at the end is that they just feel like they can speak to big debates now. They have language to explain a lot of these key issues. And I know, and that's something that's really important.
You have worked in several countries, continents. Your research focuses kind of further afield globally as well. I know you have a lot of peers and colleagues in various other countries, and I was just wondering, how do you foresee education changing as a direct result of what's currently happening?
Mm-hmm. It's this combination of drawing on the resources we have already that we know, and teachers know a lot from their professional experience, but we also have this opportunity to kind of deeply rethink what we're doing and try and mobilize some approaches. And I'd say particularly around curriculum in the UK, like I mentioned, there's this opportunity to be rethinking these high stakes tests. In the US, there are states that are saying they're not going to do the SATs, for example. So those are really important conversations, and there's lots of different people invested and interested in those, and we need to make sure that some of us educational researchers are included in the conversation to ensure that they are really, the policymakers and the people doing practice in this area are responding to the edge of the debate. To me, that is the role of scholarship, because if we don't help to make that debate edge really visible and do the work, we just end up like reproducing the things we've always done.
Absolutely. From what you've just said, it sounds like it's not a position of fear that people are coming from. It doesn't sound like we're in a fearful position. It sounds like there's actually a lot of hope and maybe excitement, would you say?
My colleague and mentor, Vanessa Andreotti, talks about skeptical optimism. And as I said, I'm in the business of productive tensions. So I don't want a superficial hopeful or a hopefulness that requires us to engage in and reinforce sanctioned ignorance. The hope is in taking up directly what's being laid in front of us, and it's up to those of us in positions of privilege to do that work. And we should have been doing it for a long time, and we've got to be doing it now because young people are asking for it. And then in my line of work around how we take up colonialism in classrooms, young people are telling us they want to do this. This is what they are engaged with. Our research is showing that they actually prefer it when you do talk about how complex things are and acknowledge when we don't actually have all the answers, rather than lead them on to come up with a solution and an action that actually doesn't do anything. Instead, of course, they can take actions, but schools are a place where we can develop this critical consciousness. So we have to push against the things that are constraining those. Now, my work did show that teachers are actually, within the exam culture, quite capable of doing that. But there are some really big ways they're being constrained by that, by all sorts of other things. It gets really overwhelming because you think, like, and this is the discussion international, with my international colleagues we're having, is just like, oh my gosh, it's overwhelming. But I think what's really important is we just stick to our thing that we're doing and push it. And you take this piece of the puzzle and you take this piece of the puzzle. And sometimes we're going to disagree. So we've got to like talk to one another and make sure, that we're mobilizing multiple approaches. But what we can't be doing is mobilizing the same approaches we've been always doing.
How is, or maybe just go into a little bit more detail about the art of unlearning and why that's important to stop current systems from being reproduced, like you've just said?
I think we have an obsession in modern developed times with growth. We think that growth is positive. I'm not an economist, but we know that capitalism, is rooted on notions of growth, and that also has found its way into the school system. And we've been really under what we call neoliberal times, which is when we take economic imperatives and agendas and attach them to public goods like education. So, for example, when I was a kid, when there was an election, we used to always talk about the citizens. Citizens are demanding this, citizens want this. And increasingly in the last 20 years, we've heard taxpayers. Taxpayers want this, taxpayers want that. And we've seen it also in schooling, where there's more of like a clientele basis between student and teachers, or even students in universities. And that has happened through all sorts of different processes. However, what's important about that is that it has kind of distracted us from getting to conversations about how we relate with one another. So I think it's essentially important that we start unlearning some of that, or challenging this growth mindset. Who's growing? Who's growth? For whom? By who gets to set the agenda for what is growth? What is wide access? Like, we've been done such important work around widening access, which is important. But now we've got to ask, access to what, right? Whose curriculum are we giving lots of people access to? Is it even relevant to them? Is it just, reinscribing the same problems that caused the lack of access in the first place? So that's what I mean by unlearning, and you can apply this kind of critical consciousness across different sectors. But in my specific work around global issues, it's that we are not going to take an approach to global issues that's ahistorical, like, oh, we have climate change, like out of the blue. No, it's deeply related, or migration, or pollution, or urbanization. These are rooted in historical things and factors. And I think the other thing about unlearning is it forces a discussion about privilege, whose positions have been privileged, what do those of us whose identities have been privileged and categorizations in society have been unquestioned, what do we need to do? How do we need to see our complicity? And that works in all sorts of different ways for all sorts of different people, but I hope that helps a little bit with what I mean by unlearning. There's a bit of a rant there.
No, it just sounds like future or current students of Manchester Met, especially those on PG courses, they will benefit from that way of your thinking and your approach to teaching. So taking that challenging approach and turning on his head and asking those questions, and not just, learning things because that's what we're used to. I know that you've been speaking, you've been contributing to agendas and conversations around rethinking and unlearning, schools rebooting after lockdown. And then one of the other things that I just wanted to get your viewpoint on was the global citizen education inequality. So how is the teaching profession supporting Black, Indigenous teachers of colour at the moment?
Mm-hmm.
Or how do you think we can improve on that going forward?
There's a lot we can do to improve, and we have to start there. So we have to find ways to have our emotions that are very heightened and natural around this. And so we can't deny those emotions, but when they come out as defensiveness, that's something we need to experience, and particularly white teachers in positions of privilege, in various positions of privilege, need to experience them, maybe talk about it together. But it can't stop there. There's so many other ways to be taking this up besides being defensive that are really active. And I think it's just about understanding that we relate with these every day, whether we're willing to look at it or not. So it's really just engaging. Like, to be honest with you, it's been a difficult time for me personally, in the sense that I've been doing work in this area for quite a long time. And it's both super exciting to me to see particularly young people really taking this cause up and, talking about white privilege and anti-Black racism, and seeing it from different minoritized groups as well, kind of calling themselves out on anti-Black racism, for example. The truth is, we don't have the perfect tools yet. We may never have the perfect tools. But we've got to engage with what we have, and we have to do things like decenter ourselves in conversations, stand up and sort of say, look, that's nice that there's this panel of all white people, what can we do about that? Or, there can be very simple, concrete things, but a lot of it, I think, has to do with, in my experience, working with educators who are largely overrepresented by white middle-class people. Not, of course, there's lots of also diverse lots of different people in the teaching profession, but we know it's overrepresented. So we have to stop thinking of race as something other people do, or other people have, or an other person's problem. Like, we have race too. We're white, we exist, our bodies get red in certain ways, it's not our fault, but we are part of this system. So I think if we just kind of center that conversation, it could be more helpful. But it's also scary, because even amongst those of us who've been doing this for a long time, we don't have it sorted out. I can't tell you the exact way to answer it. All I can say is that, it's time to step up and keep working on it. To get some of the concrete things that can happen, let's just get those done. Can we get the curriculum changed? Yes, please. Let's do some of those concrete things. At the same time, hiring practices, or prayer, things like having prayer rooms in university. These are simple things we can do. Let's just do them. But that's not the end, right? It's also doing that alongside this kind of reflexive work. I think that's a really advantage, because you get to both have these kind of deep theoretical academic discussions, which I think is the whole point of grad school, what we call grad school. But you also are having quite questions about how these things work in practice. And I don't believe that that's a dualism, right? I think, as I mentioned before, the point of scholarship is to inform practice, but then practice should also be informing scholarship.
Do you teach on any courses with us at Manchester Met?
I've been brought in multiple times and consistently to give lectures in the different units, and particularly my lectures focus on issues around comparative education. So how can we, or ought we, compare things? We're a little bit obsessed with comparing countries and education systems, for example, and kind of unpacking that, and then what are some of the methodologies around comparison. So I've been really active in giving lectures about that. And I also supervise dissertations, both master's and doctoral students.
It's absolutely fascinating what you're doing, and it's so imperative, and it's so integral to the curriculums that across the world. It's not just ours, is it?
Thank you guys so much for.
Thank you for your time.